like this, man. It's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, it seems like you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you back on. Got very, very good feedback on our last episode. And that was sort of a primer, right? We were covering things, generally going over, kind of all aspects of the topic with not a lot of detail. And we decided to jump into it in episode 2 of this series. And so you and I have been, sending each other resources back and forth, digging into, firsthand accounts, right? Material from the era that, many of these events were happening in. And specifically, right, you wanted to talk about the Son of Sam case. This is one that's sort of interesting. It is, I don't want to say faded from national consciousness because it's still there, but for someone my age, it was not sort of part of the corpus of, horrible American crime stories, right? It was always kind of a second order. You had to dig a little bit deeper. And so it was not something I was super familiar with until you started mentioning it. But do you want to, dig into that case and maybe first explain kind of the broader context and the place it took in American culture, and we can dig into specifics from there?
Yeah, absolutely. I spent a lot of time, obviously, dealing with issues related to zeitgeist and collective psychology and the psychological environment at scale. Anybody who has a Hegelian orientation in their methodology is going to have a conceptual bias in that way, I think. But also, if you're Gen X, you lived through the period of what's pejoratively, called the Satanic Panic, when, as the mainstream narrative goes, well, a bunch of Christian fundamentalists and Reaganite type of people and NGOs, they all freaked out about kids listening to, Motley Crue or Metallica records, and were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and they confabulated this entire artificial narrative of, there being demonic forces at work, sort of undermining the social fabric because, of an inability of deplorables to, accept the telluric utopia of progressivism. I mean, this is, everybody kind of knows what the main points are of that ideological fairy tale. But it was a frightening time to be a kid because this was a very real thing. There were occultic influences in the culture that were very, very sinister and very sick. And again, it doesn't matter if you or I think that kind of thing is stupid or ridiculous. People actually believed in that stuff. There was all kinds of very high profile, homicides that were inspired by occultic practices and impulses. Before we went live, I was talking about the Ripper Crew here in Chicago, which is just a horrible, horrible, sickening case. I mean, even if you got a strong stomach, the details of it will make you nauseous, and that was kind of haunting people's psyche, especially if you were like a North Sider here. And then, I'd go to Southern California with my folks, and that's, when Richard Ramirez was on his rampage, and he was leaving satanic symbols as a kind of signature at the scenes where he slaughtered people. And then when he was arrested, it was clear that he was an occult practitioner. And there was just all kinds of strange symbolism that could only be interpreted, like within the culture, I mean, within like media culture and everything else, some of which was on its face very silly and benign, some of which was anything but. You know, it did, however, constitute a defining element of the zeitgeist. And when I was a teenager and I started, kind of haunting libraries full time and taking my research and my writing seriously, I'm talking like junior high and high school age, I came across Maury Terry's book on the Son of Sam case. And I become familiar with the Son of Sam because, as anybody my age knows, I'd watch Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. Everybody did. And he did a piece on the Son of Sam, and it shook me. And generally things don't, especially not true crime type of stuff or something. And I'm a words oriented person. Like I'm not trying to personalize this, but just to provide context as to why I came to this research concentration. I'm very words oriented. I think more so even than some other writers. The Son of Sam left letters to the police and then later directly addressed to Jimmy Breslin, who was a New York City journalist. They were obviously written by different people. One in particular had profound occultic and as well as biblical references that suggested a sophistication in the subject matter. Another one written obviously in a different hand. That's the hello from the gutter letter. And it's actually really like beautifully written. It sounds like it reads like something that J.G. Ballard or Hunter S. Thompson might have written. So that particular letter pops up a lot. But as I dived into the Maury Terry book, I started researching Berkowitz quite a bit. And at that time in the 90s, he had a ministry. And if you sent away by snail mail, because that's all there was, you get literature from his ministry because people on the outside would help. Like Berkowitz wasn't holding himself out as a minister or anything, but he became a born-again Christian. And he was emphatic that, first of all, he fully accepted his guilt. He said, I'm a murderer. I murdered these people for sick and deranged reasons because I was an occultist. He's like, then I embraced Christ in prison. He's like, I am where I belong. Whether I'm eligible or not, I'm never going to seek parole. Just for context, like when he claims that he had co-conspirators and everything, he's not claiming he's not a murderer. He fully acknowledges that. But so I sent away to the Berkowitz ministry and I got this like packet of information. Some of it was typical kind of holy roller stuff, but some of it was alleging occultism is real. It touches and concerns the lives of people in ways prosaic and profound. It's insinuated into the lives of regular people as well as elites. And this is very deliberate. Okay. And I remember a girl I know at the time who I was tight with, she's like, you're like losing your mind. You're going down your rabbit hole. Like, she'd claim that I periodically drifted off to Thomas World, and like she'd snap her fingers in my face, like mostly because of like I had my face buried in like a book on the Third Reich, and I wasn't like looking at her body or something, but like I remember vividly her telling me about the Berkowitz thing. She's like, this is like the craziest Thomas World rabbit hole ever. So I was
to your point, and I just want to interject this before
go ahead,
we keep moving, about that hello from the gutter letter, which is easy to find. It's worth reading. You're right. It is well written. It's sort of paraphrased in the graphic novel Watchmen, right?
Right. I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we'll come back to the sort of like symbolic importance of dogs, because there's a very striking scene in Watchmen which is paired, if I'm not mistaken, it's either right before or, sort of juxtaposed to the art of, Rorschach, who is this sort of, vigilante-esque character, going to a house where a murderer, a group of murderers. It's been a while since I've gone through it, but have, been disposing of, the bodies of children by feeding them to a dog. And, as he goes through and, very brutally kills these men, he uses again, I would put a content warning on this, but you know what you're getting into, right? Like at this point, this is an R-rated show effectively, but he uses a knife to, split the skull of this dog that's been used as basically to cover up these murders. Right. And over top of that, very graphic imagery is sort of a retelling of that same letter, right? It's not exactly the same, but if you've read one and seen the other, they're very much parallel. So really that letter, its impact on culture cannot be overstated. But
yeah, there's an overkill song, I think literally called "Hello from the Gutter." Mm-hmm. And the first Son of Sam letter, like to be clear, the Son of Sam murders, basically what happened was beginning in April 1977, mostly around Brooklyn and the Bronx, but and Burgos himself was from Yonkers, so I mean, he was deliberately, him and his accomplices were deliberately staging their hunting ground away from where they lived. But the Son of Sam, he would approach generally couples, mostly in cars parked, but sometimes exclusive. He'd approach two women. It was generally pairs of people on foot, and he'd open fire on them with a 44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog, which was an unusual weapon. At short range, it's got massive stopping power. Correction, the first killing was July 1976, not 77. In that killing, Donna Loria and Jody Valenti, two women, they were approached and they were shot. And Valenti survived with injuries. And she basically described Berkowitz to a T. She said, white male, mid-30s, 5'8", heavy-set, curly, dark hair in a mod style. And she said that, and this was significant, she said he adopted like a shooter stance, like a shooter's crouch. And he fired all 5 shots at him. The police initially were really worried that Son of Sam was a cop, because a Charter Arms 44, that's the kind of weapon an off-duty cop in the era would carry. The guy was taking police and military shooter stance. And obviously, anybody who's been in the service knows, or anyone knows anything about the police, or probably even if you go to take a firearms course, they tell you to pull the trigger until you're out of ammo, and that's exactly what he did. And then in October, Carl DeNaro, who periodically appears on podcasts, he survived. And Rosemary Keenan, who was a girl he was seeing, they were sitting in Keenan's parked car. DeNaro was at the wheel, and they didn't see anything. Somebody opened up. Rosemary was murdered. She died. I think... or actually, no, she survived. DeNaro needed a plate in his head because he got a chunk of his skull just like blasted out. But they didn't see anything. But again, I believe that's the scene where 44 caliber slugs were recovered. So before the Son of Sam deposited his first letter in spring of 77. He was called the 44 caliber killer, and significantly, as these shootings went on, one of them, both the victims were barely hit, and they relayed that it was a slight man with a high pitched voice who had poor fire discipline because a 44 caliber bulldog had a lot of recoil, and it sounded like they were describing a woman, and both of them said, that they couldn't tell if it was like an effeminate male or a woman, but whatever sex the attacker was, David Berkowitz isn't like a slight blonde guy who you mistake for a female. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, obviously he wasn't, but he looks like the kind of guy you'd imagine to be a 70s New York cop, right? Heavy set, kind of built like an aging, honestly built kind of like an aging D3 wrestler or something like that.
Well, to be clear too, Berkowitz didn't, I don't think there's I don't put any stock in criminal profiling. I think it's garbage. I know people, I think guys like that Mindhunter guy are a total fraud. John Douglas, he's a ridiculous con man. But such that there is a profile people either associate kind of colloquially, as it were, or otherwise with a serial killer, Berkowitz doesn't fit that profile. Berkowitz is kind of a sad early upbringing. He was born out of wedlock to a Jewish woman, and his birth father was Jewish as well. But I believe he was an older man who was carrying on an affair with this much younger woman, and he didn't want anything to do with her when she got pregnant. So she put David up for adoption through this Jewish adoption agency. So Berkowitz's adopted parents, were Jews also, because that was the whole notion, raised unwanted Jewish babies in the culture. And he was very close to his father, his mom, not so much. And he didn't know he was adopted until he was an adult, but he very much revolted against the 60s counterculture. He was I think for a time, he was actually a member of the John Birch Society. He was a gun aficionado. He fancied himself kind of a tough guy. He joined the army. He was just a little too young for Nam. And it was like when they were when the Pentagon was drawing down forces, that he got out of basic training, but he was in the infantry and he deployed to Korea, and he did well. He was honorably discharged. The only mark on his record, if memory serves, he was carousing with a prostitute one time, is obviously, I'm sure, is not an uncommon thing, in the service. But he did well there. And when he was discharged, he bounced around to different jobs, but he settled in as a postal worker. That's kind of cliche, like the postal worker psycho. But, long story short, Berkowitz, ultimately, it's his car that gets him arrested. He had a Ford Galaxy, which is a very distinct ride. It had a huge big block V8. It was one of these giant luxury sedan, like Pimpmobile type rides from the era. There's a few different vehicles spotted leaving the scene of the shootings. And as it turned out, there was a bunch of parking tickets, outstanding fines attached to this car. I won't bore you with the subject, the details, but Berkowitz gets arrested and he says to the cops, "What took you so long to find me?" Then he confesses immediately, and he's obviously rational, but the only thing he tells the police is, "Yeah, I'm insane as a matter of law, and in fact, my neighbor's dog told me to kill people because I'm insane. I don't want to talk about anything else. I confess." And these shootings, these murders, had New York City in abject panic. It was, so NYPD and the city administration and the mayor's office they wanted to get this over and done with ASAP. And this was after, New York City's bond rating had bottomed out and President Ford refused to bail them out. So they ended up laying off something like a quarter of the NYPD's staff. The city was going to hell in all kinds of ways. This was like the Warriors era, The last thing anybody wanted was to continue probing into the Son of Sam murders when they had a good suspect for at least some of the killings and he was willing to confess. But, as Terry and other people dug into the case, they realized this didn't make any sense. And it turned out, this is fact. If whatever you choose to accept or not about what Terry alleged or how I interpret these facts, in my own estimation, Bergowitz was involved in occultism. And according to him, when he got out of the service, he was adrift. He didn't believe in Judaism anymore. He didn't even really believe in God anymore. So he said at first he started getting into like mysticism and some Kabbalah type stuff. Then he started reading up on Satanism. Then he got turned on to this cult in Yonkers that these two guys, John and Michael Carr, who were the literal sons of Sam. Their father was Sam Carr. And they had a sister, Wheat Carr, who had a blonde bob haircut and at distance kind of looked like a man. But the Carr brothers had been involved in Scientology, and then they invited David to attend these coven ceremonies they were involved in. And to be clear what the connection is between Scientology and this kind of occultism in America, you've got to understand what the origins is of American occultism as we know it, and what L. Ron Hubbard was trying to accomplish with Scientology. This is a bit of a tangent, but I'll bring it back because it's essential to understand how all this developed. There was a man named Jack Parsons, and Parsons was an experimental rocket scientist, and he actually was a pioneer in this field. He collaborated closely with Edward Foreman. Foreman, I believe, facilitated the first jet-assisted takeoff of an aircraft. And Foreman ended up working for the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory. He had a stellar resume. Parsons, in his own right, he pioneered composite rocket fuel. I believe he patented what's called a castable solid fuel. And this was a huge deal, obviously, especially as the Cold War got underway. But Parsons, right around the time World War II kicked off in earnest, he married a woman named Helen Northrup. And they both joined Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO. Later, Parsons, as he got deeper into Thelema, as it's called, he divorced Helen Northrup. And he married this woman named Marjorie Cameron, who was like a femme fatale out of a movie or something. She was a lifelong occultist. She was a high-end prostitute. She had this like flaming red hair, and guys would get all stupid around her because she was, this sex bomb. And Parsons believed she was to be the instantation of some sort of goddess or elemental being that could be summoned through Thelemite sexual rites and rituals. I'm not making this up. Well, Marjorie Cameron's sometime client or boyfriend was this broke-ass writer named L. Ron Hubbard. And Parsons kind of tolerated Hubbard hanging around him and Marjorie because I mean, I assume that Marjorie put it to him is this guy's harmless and, you know, he's just my friend. Well, Hubbard ended up defrauding Parsons, who was fairly wealthy, for a huge amount of money, and he stole his wife. You know, Marjorie ran off with L. Ron Hubbard. So Hubbard took Parsons' money, and he took a bunch of his notes on occultism, and then he put his own spin on this stuff, you know, throwing in like hokey space opera and, you know, devising things that he figured would appeal to people, you know, susceptible to direct marketing kinds of pitches and stuff. Basically, what Scientology is it's this half-ass Thelemite come science fiction con that is like the For Dummies version of stuff Jack Parsons believed in, minus the Xenu stuff and the alien stuff. That's all Hubbard and crap that would pop up in his pulp stories. But that's what Scientology is. Okay, how does this relate to the Son of Sam? Well, Scientology at first made a pretty big impact in the UK. In the 60s, a lot of counterculture types got into it, because that's how it was presented. It was presented kind of this holistic anti-psychology movement. And in those days, psychology, particularly Freudian paradigms for human behavior, this was just considered to be dogma, you know, not just in university environs, but even in a lot of medical circles, incredible as that might seem. So the Church of Scientology in the UK, it attracted a lot of lesser noble types, as well as you know, counterculture intellectuals and things like that. And it attracted in particular this couple, Robert de Grimstone and his wife Marianne. And they very quickly kind of determined that Scientology was a con and it was a lot of nonsense. So what they did was they took some people who had kind of come to reason in relative terms within their Scientology congregation, and they splintered off and moved to Mexico or on the Yucatan Peninsula because Robert the Grimstone considered that to be a place that was where one could practice meditation in a way that would be profitable in the metaphysical sense. He claims that on a vision quest, he made contact with three great entities. They were Jehovah, literally the Jehovah of the Bible, Lucifer, who was some kind of forebear or harbinger of the devil, and Satan himself. And in kind of almost Lovecraftian terms, the Grimstone said, these are the three great gods of the universe. Okay? And they're representative on earth. You know, their herald was Jesus Christ. Okay? And people who can access communion with these deities through a combination of spiritual practice, astral projection, drug use, and the acquisition of forbidden knowledge in correct environments where the mind can be opened to these pre-rational experiences. You know, you can come to understand literally the process that is underway towards this apocalyptic end of, you know, the telluric existence of Earth. And only the people who can understand these great gods and their intentions and, you know, the meaning of their offices, you know, through esoteric interpretation of the teachings and words of Christ. Only these people are going to survive the apocalypse physically, and they're going to rule as gods on earth over what they call the gray masses, who they basically consider to be like no better than animals. They're just they're natural slaves, and when this apocalyptic paradigm ensues, they're going to serve us, who are the elect, if you want to look at it like that. Okay, and key to process theology is this both kind of bastardized Nietzscheanism and dumbed down Hegelian view that certain individuals and movements and ideological tendencies within discrete phases of zeitgeist represent apocal forces towards this apocalyptic resolution. And one of those figures was Adolf Hitler. Okay. So the process started associating with a lot of National Socialist and fascist type elements because they believed in America, at least, one of the things that's going to kick off this process of apocalypse and, cleansing is a race war. So if you assist these revolutionary National Socialist types as much as you can, and, if you bring as many dedicated partisans into that fold as you can, you can hasten the arrival of this apocalyptic race war. And these National Socialist types can also kind of be your vanguard, even if they don't accept or fully understand the theology they're serving. That doesn't matter. And this is why you find these occult types. I'm not slandering anybody. I personally like a lot of these people, and I think their interest in occultism is often academic and somewhat benign. Nick Abugas, who's a Wyatt Man, the cartoonist. Our friend Derek, the Bloody Mess and the Scabs frontman, who I interview periodically, he's buddies with Nick Abugas, Nicholas Schreck, James Mason, Boyd Rice. These guys, all to varying degrees, maintain an active correspondence with Charles Manson. Schreck married Zena LaVey, who was Anton LaVey's daughter. And LaVey was something of, he wasn't any kind of deep thinker, but beyond the sort of carny and silly aspects of his public persona and his grift, I think he very much believed in this kind of stuff too. And he sought out James Hartung Madol and a lot of other National Socialist types, I believe, for identical reasons. Okay. And interestingly, the Process Church, this is when the zine culture was kind of first coming into its own. The Process Church published a zine, and each one had a theme. It would be, for example, the sex issue, or it would be the money issue. Well, there's one called the death issue, and part of the collage on the cover features that famous photograph of SS Liebstandart taking the midnight oath before the pylons outside the honor temple. And one of the essays in there was a contributor to it was none other than Charles Manson, because Manson at the Spahn Ranch with his communitarian family, as it were, a lot of things he was proselytizing seemed to derive from the Process Church and their teaching. So the Process quite literally sent some of their delegates there to see what was going on.
Well, if I'm correct, the purported motive for his murders were to kick off some sort of apocalyptic race war.
Yeah,
it was supposed to be sort of a false flag attack.
Yeah, and my interpretation of that with some qualifications, I basically agree with Nicholas Schreck. The Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring, and those people who were massacred at the Polanski house. Tex Watson was basically paying back Sebring for over dope business, okay? And it got out of hand. And when Watson, in his acid-soaked brain, realized he had a real problem on his hands, his notion was, well, let's try and pass this off on Blackie to get the police off our trail, but also maybe we can exploit this to kind of hasten the coming apocalypse. And then they killed the LaBiancas. And again, this makes no sense to a rational person, but in the disturbed mind of Watson and the girls, and you know, it made sense. They killed the LaBiancas to make it look like this was a pattern of racial warfare. Okay, so that became a secondary motive, but I believe it initially was what I just said it was. And Manson was known to associate with Scientologists as well, but specifically, there was this process offshoot that called itself the Children. And Manson, by some accounts, was trying to establish sort of his own congregation based directly on that, you know, occult sensibility and orientation. And I think there's something to that. And Manson famously, that guy that he gut shot, his street name was Lotsa Papa. I can't remember what his government name was, but this black guy, a pimp. And, you know, Manson's hustle, first and foremost, he was a pimp. That was like his go-to hustle, you know, and as strange as it might seem, you know, like women liked Manson. That's why he always had girls around him, because he was a pimp, and like all pimps, he fancied himself kind of a Lothario. But I mean, girls actually liked the guy. And so Manson, it was either because Manson borrowed money from Lotsa Papa to try and fund his demo, or Manson also would deal in like cannabis and mescaline. Like, he wouldn't deal any real dope, but he'd fuck around with like hippie drugs. This guy either owed him money and burned him, or he didn't, or Manson didn't come through with the VIG. And this guy Lotsa Papa was always claiming to be plugged in with the Panthers. And I guess at one time he threatened to assault the Spawn Ranch with a bunch of Black Panthers and slaughter everybody. So like Manson ended up shooting him in the gut, and he survived. But then Manson got totally paranoid that there were, you know, some like Black Panther mobs going to assault the Spawn Ranch. That's how Manson and the family got clicked up with the Satan slaves. We're like this 1%er biker mob that, like all such, like all such crews of the era, were basically like, you know, like very racialist. Because he said to those, he was giving those guys like free weed and mescaline and stuff, and giving them access to the girls if they'd like stay at the ranch and defend it. That's kind of when the ranch became like an armed camp. So like Bugliosi looked at all these things and the fragments in his kind of square mind that he pieced together. He concluded, and I think part of this was, you know, prosecutors make up stories because that's how you sell things to a jury. But I also think he essentially believed this. His kind of half-digested, half-understood version is Manson was this cult guru like Jim Jones, and he believed that like a race war was imminent, and these ideas belonged to him. You know, Bugliosi, I think it did stipulate that Manson was affiliated with the Process Church, but he didn't consider it to be particularly significant. But point being, Bugliosi interpreted this in part for pragmatic reasons, in part just because he's not like a deep thinker. He interpreted this as, what the Helter Skelter narrative is that we all know. That Manson was this strange cult leader with this idiosyncratic and bizarre view of race war and apocalypse and the end times. And these homicides were him ordering his followers to try and hasten and perpetuate this apocalyptic paradigm through these homicides. To bring this back to Terry, Maury Terry's interpretation, and there's some evidence, there's more than, there's persuasive evidence to substantiate this. The cult Manson belonged to constituted far more people than just the Manson family. Nor was the Manson family its most significant iteration. The cult that the Carr brothers and their sister got Berkowitz involved in was the East Coast faction of that same cult. And what the Son of Sam was doing, what they were doing, I believe the Son of Sam was the Carr brothers, their sister Wheat Carr, and David Berkowitz, plus a wheelman. Okay? What they were doing was twofold. They were basically committing occult terrorism. And for context, in 76, 77, domestic terrorism was jumping off all over the place. This was the Patty Hearst era. This was just beyond the zebra killing eras. Let's not get into the zebra killings. There was all manner of Maoist and Marxist-Leninist outfits that were bombing police stations, robbing banks, murdering people. Aircraft hijackings were a regular occurrence. So this process offshoot cult, their congregants essentially concluded the writing's on the wall. It's jumping off. In New York City, what's the best way to provoke a panic? And, who is an ideal victim as a sacrificial offering, but young women. And even though a large caliber handgun might be inelegant and might not be ideal for a ceremonial purpose, the reality of life in the big city dictates this is the way we got to do it. And one of Terry's sources, and as we get deeper into this, I'll explicate why I think he was probably telling the truth, suggested at least some of these Son of Sam murders were filmed. And they were filmed literally for the masturbatory pleasure of people like Roy Radin, who'd exhibit these things at their parties. And for context, now people see horrible stuff and now I don't even think about it. Whether it's, three guys, one hammer, or footage of people maimed at work. In those days, unless you happen to come across a live news broadcast where something, from a combat zone or from Angola or something, you didn't see graphic violence in video format. You certainly didn't see murders happening in real time. This was crazy, it'd be very, very titillating to sickos, especially people who had, not to be gross, but a masturbatory interest in this kind of material. And somebody like Radin, who I'll get into shortly who he was, especially an occultist like Roy Radin, who could point to that and say, see, I know who these people are, and I know why they're doing this. They're doing this because I'm a shot caller in this church, and we're bringing it all down. And these are the sacrificial victims that are gonna facilitate it. Like, that'd be a real power flex to a guy like Roy Radin. Okay.
So just a brief interjection, right? You mentioned the Three Guys, One Hammer video, which I'm familiar with, thankfully have not seen.
It's horrifying.
But if I remember correctly, that was produced by a small gang of Ukrainian teenagers. Two kids who were filmed, and there were dozens of films, many of which were not made public, with a third accomplice holding the camera, who I don't believe actually served very much time at all. The other two kids who were involved got life sentences. But one of the interesting things is that the ringleader, Ukrainian name, can't remember it, he alleged that they had been given an obscene amount of money and promised more to film, I believe it was 40 snuff films, and that the reason they had been recording them was for this, shadowy third party. Now, obviously, simple allegations. It may shock you, Thomas, that Ukrainian criminal justice is not exactly the best in the world. But I thought that was worth bringing up just because you sort of see a similar, at least, inference there, that there is a much wider ring paying for and distributing these sort of extremely graphic videos. But I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, there's something weird about that case. Beyond don't get me wrong, those kids are complete animals, and they're obviously sadists, and they like to hurt and kill people. But the way they were going about it, and I watched that video a few times. I mean, it's horrible. It turned my stomach. But that's the only reason I watched it. I don't like seeing that kind of material at all. But a friend of mine, he was really upset by it, and he shared your perspective. He thinks that that's what it was, and I'll leave it at that. But some of the technique involved, I think, tends to substantiate that. That's the reason why I viewed it. But yeah, so, and understand briefly, the Berkowitz case came back into the news. I was running out of time, but this is an essential aspect of Terry's whole theory and Berkowitz's claim. Terry was initially not particularly persuaded by what Berkowitz was telling him. Terry went to meet, first he started corresponding with Berkowitz, who was then serving his life sentence. Then he ended up going to meet him. And Berkowitz made it clear. He said, look, the reason why I confessed to everything, and again, he didn't deny his culpability. He said, I am a murderer. And I committed these murders for the most horrific of reasons. He wasn't trying to issue responsibility. But he said, if I come out and tell you certain things, and if you publicize I'm telling you these things, they're going to kill my father. And I can't have anybody hurting my father. He's my only living relative, and I love him. I mean, obviously you love your dad, And he said, I knew that they'd kill my family if I didn't take the fall and then not speak on this subject matter. And I believe that to be true. And then when Berkowitz's father did die, Berkowitz opened up about a lot more of this stuff. But when let me find my place, just because I don't go off a script, but I want to make sure my data points are correct. But there was a young lady named Arlis Perry. In 1974, she was murdered at the chapel on the Stanford University campus. And she was originally from South Dakota. And when one of the Carr brothers was stationed down there, it's speculated that he was stalking her. Okay. Now, to bring it back for context, Berkowitz wrote this brief note to Terry as it being played. Terry didn't believe him. That I believe it just said Arlis Perry stalked, raped, murdered, sacrificed, followed to California. Suggesting that Terry should look into it, because I believe it wasn't a national news story. It was pretty local, but Arlis Perry was this beautiful 19-year-old girl. She was very religious. She was a newlywed. She and her husband had a fight, and she went to the chapel, which is this really ornate chapel, to pray and meditate. She never came home. Arlis Perry was discovered. She'd been murdered and sexually assaulted. She was posed, her body was posed on the altar. One of the altar candles was shoved into her vagina. Her pants had been removed. Her legs were spread eagle opposite, so were her pants. So if you were observing this from above, it would form what looks like a diamond symbol, if you follow me. And this was a cold case until 2018. And the way that resolved was totally bizarre. And we'll get into that. But Berkowitz's claim is that Arlis Perry was the first sacrifice. And that's the reason why. I mean, she was very attractive and beautiful, and I'm sure that lust always plays a role, undoubtedly, in the minds of these evil people who do these kinds of things. And she was a pious Christian, Arlis Perry was the first sacrifice to kick off this cycle of killing that was tailored to bring about revolutionary conditions that would in turn facilitate the literal process of, realizing the return of these, of Jehovah and Lucifer and Satan and the second coming again in their apostasy. They view Christ as a herald of the aforementioned, who similarly are viewed as kind of terror gods within that warped theology. The first Son of Sam letter, which I find incredibly disturbing, I'm going to read it and break down how I interpret it. And I've researched this for years. This letter was discovered on April 17, 1977, at the scene of the murders of Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau. It says, "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a woman hater." Obviously, he means woman hater, but he spells it like demon. This bunch of deliberate misspellings. "I'm really hurt by calling me a woman hater. I am not, but I am a monster. I am the Son of Sam. I'm a little brat. When Father Sam gets drunk, he gets mean. He beats his family. Sometimes he ties me up to the back of the house. Other times he locks me in the garage. This is being written from literally a dog's perspective. And wolves, and specifically German shepherds, have a totemic significance in the process."
Well, and not to needlessly make another callback, but that scene in Watchmen, it's German shepherds. It's multiple German shepherds. Again,
Yep.
Just an interesting connection. But sorry, Thomas, I interrupted.
No, don't be sorry. And again, Sam Carr, who was the Carr brothers' father, his constant companion was his German shepherd. So moving on to the language of the letter, Sam loves to drink blood. Go out and kill, commands Father Sam. Behind our house, some rest, mostly young, raped and slaughtered. Their blood drained, just bones now. Papa Sam keeps me locked in the attic, too. I can't get out, but I look out the attic window and watch the world go by. I feel like an outsider. However, to stop me, you must kill me. Attention all police. Shoot me first. Shoot to kill or else. Keep out of my way or you will die. Papa Sam is old now. He needs some blood to preserve his youth. He has had too many heart attacks. Too many heart attacks. Ugh. Me hoot. It hurts, sonny boy. Now here we're getting to what's most significant. I miss my pretty princess most of all. She's resting in Our Lady's house, but I'll see her soon. Okay. Stanford Memorial Church, it was commissioned by Jane Stanford, who was this Victorian feminist. And she commissioned it in honor of her late husband. Now the church, this is, the church obviously that poor Arlis Perry was murdered in. The church is technically non-denominational, but it's a lovely structure. It draws inspiration from Byzantine details, but overall it's a pre-Raphaelite Romanesque design. But the motif of it emphasizes the piety of women within Christianity. Like the centerpiece is Christ and Christography, but the whole motif otherwise is, the piety of women within the faith, So he's talking about Arlis Perry in Our Lady's house. He's also mocking, Catholic reverence for the Virgin Mother. I mean, this is all very clear, and this somehow was lost on the police. Going on, I am the monster, Beelzebub, the chubby behemoth. Now, Beelzebub is Lord of the Flies. It's understood if you take demonology seriously, which obviously Berkowitz did, assuming he was the writer of this, or the Carr brothers. Well, I speculate with the writer of this letter. Beelzebub is not just a synonym for Satan or devil, although it's interpreted that way a lot. Beelzebub's a winged demon of great power, and significantly, he led a successful rebellion against the devil. So he's hungry for power. And he's a partisan within hell and its domain. And of course, a behemoth is a titanic beast. He's the land. His domain is the land. He's the earthly, or the territorial counterpart to Leviathan. He's Lord of the land. He's voraciously hungry. He's gluttonous for power and domination and mastery over this planet, as are the elect, the hunters, the masters who will inherit the earth after the race war. Moving on. I love to hunt, prowling the streets looking for fair game, tasty meat. The women of Queens are the prettiest of all. It must be the water they drink. I live for the hunt, my life. Blood for Papa. Mr. Borelli, sir. Borelli was one of the investigating officers. I don't want to kill anyone anymore. No, sir, no more, but I must. Honor thy father. I want to make love to the world. I love people. I don't belong on earth. Return me to Yahus. Yahos. Here's how I interpret this. Yahus, it's a bastardized phonetic spelling of your house. In Mark 3:22, the scribes or the Pharisees, they accused Jesus of driving out demons by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of demons, as he's referred to. That name and that spelling, Beelzebub, that also appears in Matthew 12:24, 27, Luke 11:15 and 11:18 and 19, and in Matthew 10:25. It's unknown what the exact meaning of that idiosyncratic spelling is. But the consensus, as far as my research suggests, the Hebrew Zebul, Zebul, that term appears in 1 Kings 8:13 in the context of the phrase Bet Zebul, which translates roughly as lofty house or noble house. Okay. So he's saying, I'm going to enter the noble house by, hastening the arrival of the true gods, who your kind, as part of the gray mass, views as demons. And in your ignorance, you can only perceive this telluric utopia of masters and this return to the wolf age. You can only interpret it as something demonic and horrifying. That's my interpretation. I've given this a lot of thought. Take that for what it's worth. I'm not a Bible scholar, but I do know some things. We've gone past the hour, man. I hope this wasn't too esoteric or non-linear. I'm trying to...
No, not at all.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm glad we dug this deep, because even in the notes that you sent me, there's more to get into. Obviously, the plan for this is to, go on for several subsequent episodes. So we'll definitely have you on in another week. But yeah, this is fascinating. I was aware of...
Okay,
oh yeah, no, this was... I've joked before that a good episode of the Jay Burden Show is one where I say less than 5 things. I think I've hit that, not counting, wrapping up the show at the end. But yeah, I was unaware of what you referred to as the sort of like bastardized Nietzschean themes in specifically, the Process Church. It wasn't something I was very familiar with, but it is something you see elsewhere. And one of the things that we mentioned in the first episode, and I got a very kind comment and phone call from our mutual friend, Rod Dodson, about this.
That's
right,
awesome.
Which is the idea of that sort of Nietzschean transcendence expressed in a different way, right? Of, sort of removing your consciousness from your body and becoming more than simply a man. And I think that's an interesting through line through a lot of this, right? The process of kind of like, ritually separating your soul, your consciousness from your body to become more than human. And even then, right, in that letter, right, where he's saying like, kill me so I can go back home, right? You see that same idea. I was talking with our mutual friend, Stormy Waters, who's very knowledgeable on these topics. And I will be pulling more from that conversation as we go forward. But one of the things that he and I were speaking about that was interesting, related, there will be more details on this because I realize we're fast, approaching time. But talking about the degree to which exposure, especially at a young age, to extreme violence and sexual abuse produces dissociative identity disorder, right? A separation internally of consciousness in the body, but also of multiple personality disorder, right? That your consciousness in the most strict medical sense either shatters or other consciousnesses are sort of worming their way into you, either way. And that sort of through line of sort of transcendence through degradation, through ritual is one that I think we will see throughout this. So that's I guess sort of a teaser to keep listening. We'll keep digging here. Thomas, this was a really fascinating episode. I learned a lot from it. If people want to find more of you and more of your work, obviously they can check you out on Substack, where you put out a lot of stuff. You and I have been plugging away at Radio Free Chicago, which you can find either on Gumroad or Substack. All of your links will be down in the description. I guess I'm much like everyone else, really anticipating your long form content coming out. Yeah, I know you've been working hard on it, and
thank you, man.
You'll be back next week.
Dedicating the summer to, yeah.
Well, sure thing, man. I am looking forward to the next one. As far as my stuff, right? Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. Episodes come out early and ad-free, either on Substack, Patreon, Gumroad. Yeah, man, like I said, I always get good feedback on our work, but this one in particular, got some very interesting messages for some interesting people. I won't name all of them, but yeah, I think this is some of the most important stuff you and I have talked about, and yeah, I'm looking forward to keep digging.
No, that's great, man. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm very pleased that you find it worthwhile and that the subs do too, because I was worried I might not be delivering as I need to. So yeah, thank you, man.
Well, sure thing, man. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.